Hi, my name is Nicole with So Much More, and in today's video, I'm going to share all about the Falling For You quilt pattern. We're going to be cutting the fabric, we're going to be piecing this together, and we're even going to quilt this on the long arm. So let's get started. We're going to be using a lot of my favorite things, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about them before we get started. I'm a TrueCut brand ambassador, and they have a really great cutting system. I'm going to be using a variety of rulers and some of their rotary blades, as well as the cutting mat that comes in their travel case. The Falling For You quilt pattern is my latest pattern release. For this video, I'm going to be making the queen size quilt. This pattern also has the throw and the full sizes available. For a majority of my piecing, I'm going to be using the Juki DX4000. This is a large throat space, which is perfect for free motion quilting, although in this video, I'll be doing our quilting on the long arm. And in case you're wondering about this orange sticker on top of my extension table, it's called a grid glider. This accessory has tons of seam allowance markings, which help me achieve the perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. And of course, I love good lighting. You can learn more about the Twist-to-Go lamp in my online shop. The Falling For You quilt pattern is available in a variety of sizes. This pattern features the maple leaf quilt block in 2 sizes. I love the larger leaf and all the smaller leaves that surround it. I chose some solids for my online shop. This fall fabric bundle turned out to be the perfect combination for this Falling For You quilt. So let's dive into making the maple leaf quilt blocks. The first thing I do is mark a line corner to corner on the wrong side of the fabric with the marking pen or chalk pencil. I'm actually using a friction pen for this step, and the fabric that I'm marking on is my background fabric. Then you're going to match up your background fabric with the fabric for your leaves, and then you're going to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of the marked diagonal line. Cut along the marked line to make 2 oversized half square triangle units, and you're going to press the seams towards your leaf fabric. I'm using a mini iron from Oliso. This is the perfect size next to your sewing machine, and it comes in a variety of colors. Trim the half square triangle units using the 45-degree line on your ruler. Use the measurements found in your pattern to make your finished half square triangle pieces. To make your stem, take a piece of your background fabric and cut it in half diagonally. Take the rectangle piece of your leaf fabric and align it right sides together with a diagonal cut edge of your background triangle. Sew the seam and press it towards the leaf fabric. Next, align the second triangle with the edge of your leaf rectangle. Sew the seam and press it towards the leaf fabric. Align the 45-degree line on your ruler to the center of the stem fabric. Use your pattern to make sure that your measurements don't extend beyond the fabric and trim against the corner of the ruler. Rotate 180 degrees and repeat the trimming on the other side. And this is your stem unit. Gather all of the pieces that you've cut and assembled for your maple leaf quilt block. Arrange them in this fashion and start sewing your rows together. Go ahead and reference your pattern, which gives you the directions on which way to press your seams so that everything nests together beautifully. I'll be following exactly the same steps for the large maple leaf quilt block, except everything is supersized. Now, I found it much easier to use sewing pins for this block just to keep the fabrics from shifting, since this block is so much bigger than the rest of the blocks in the quilt. You may have noticed that I switched sewing machines. This is the Juki TL2010Q, and it's a straight stitch machine. I'm also using a grid glider on the extension table, which helps me maintain a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once all the maple leaf quilt blocks have been assembled, all we have left to do is put the rows together. This quilt comes together quickly because of the large areas of negative space. The quilt pattern is a great example of a modern quilt because I'm using solid fabrics and I have a vast amount of negative space. Because I'm making a queen size quilt, I've transitioned my ironing task to the ironing board. I'm using the large size Oliso for this work, and it makes quick tasks of pressing my seams as I assemble each row. With each row addition, the quilt becomes a little more cumbersome to handle. I'm using sewing pins so that the two pieces don't shift during assembly. One of the great features of the Juki DX4000 is that it has a built-in walking foot. This keeps the top and bottom fabric from shifting during sewing. And I'm also taking the time to remove each pin before I sew over it. The last thing I want to do is to change a broken needle. I'm finally on the home stretch of assembling the quilt top. I have the two halves of the top coming together on the last seam. So when I'm assembling these rows together, it's important for me to locate the center of each row first. I insert a pin in the center and then to the end of each row, and then I work my way to the middle with the sewing pins. I'm also taking my time to adjust the fabric as I progress along the seam, and I know that if I take my time and I do my best, that my quilt will turn out better for it. Now that the quilt top is finished, we have to take a moment and appreciate the size of this quilt. I am so excited to quilt this quilt. Now before we load everything onto the long arm, we need to get the wrinkles out of the batting. I love using wide back batting. You don't have to join seams, and all you have to do is make sure that it's the right length. When I load the backing onto my long arm, I use red snappers. These are a great tool for the long arm quilter to help them easily attach their backing to the leaders of their long arm. I am a Juki brand ambassador. Did you know that Juki uses Grace frames and also uses the Graced software for quilt automation? My long arm is the Juki J350 QVP, and I have a 10-foot frame, which is the perfect size for my room and my needs. Now that I have my backing loaded onto my long arm, I'm going to float my batting and my quilt top. I'm using Quilter's Dream Request batting, which is a lightweight 100% cotton batting. I'm just aligning my batting to the top of my backing and letting the remainder float or fall over the edge. And I'm doing the same with the quilt top while making sure that I align the center of the quilt to the center of the backing. The rest of this is just basting. I actually baste my entire quilt before I start the quilting process. This is not a required thing to do. This is just something that I prefer to do so that my quilt doesn't shift throughout the quilting process. My Juki J350 QVP has a basting stitch that's already built into the machine. I like to make my basting stitch with a contrasting thread. This makes it obvious to me which thread needs to be removed, whether I'm in the process of quilting or after I'm finished quilting the entire quilt. This queen size quilt measures about 104 inches in length, and it'll take me several advances to baste the entire quilt. But once I'm finished basting the quilt, I'll advance the quilt back to the beginning and start plotting out the quilt automation. I use Quilter's Creative Touch 5, otherwise known as QCT5. And I also have the Gold membership, which gives me access to over 750 quilt pattern designs. And I found this perfect design which incorporates a quilted maple leaf. This is an edge-to-edge or continuous line design, which means it starts on one edge of the quilt and works its way all the way to the other edge. And once I'm finished with a single pass, then I would advance my quilt and repeat the design again. And because this quilt is large, I will have advanced this design throughout the quilt about 8 times. The thread that I'm using is a thread that really blends into the background. My background fabric is linen. The color is linen by Paintbrush Studio Fabrics, and it blends perfectly with the Superior Omni thread. I believe the actual color is called cream, and the number is 3004. The foot that I'm using on my Juki J350 QVP is called a glide foot. Now, some people often refer to this as a spoon foot, and I use this foot often because it does just like the name suggests. It glides over the quilt and doesn't get hung up on any three-dimensional piecing or any of the edges either. Using quilt automation to finish your quilts is very rewarding. I love how I can browse the design files and choose some things, anything that's perfect for my project. And as I mentioned, QCT5 has a ton of options. There are so many videos and resources on this software. I've even recently started making my own, and I publish them on my own YouTube channel. Feel free to check those out when you get a chance. Once we get the quilt all quilted, it's time to trim. I'm using my large TrueCut ruler, and I'm also using the TrueCut Comfort Cutter. The My Comfort Cutter is the top-of-the-line ergonomic rotary cutter. Its Comfort Curve grip is especially designed to make rotary cutting easier, safer, and more accurate. And I appreciate how the handle reduces the stress on the wrist and the arm, and everyone from beginners to advanced cutters love the track and guide for straight cuts every time. The Comfort Curve grip of my Comfort Cutter is designed to give you the most natural feeling cut ever. I'm trimming this quilt quite easily, and I'm also able to make quick work of cutting out my binding. The My Comfort Cutter aligns naturally with your arm as you cut, relieving stress on your wrist, arm, and shoulder, even over extended periods of cutting. I'm trimming my binding strips at 2.5 inches in width. And after I trim my bindings, I sew them together on the diagonal. I use the center line on my grid glider to help guide my stitches from one end of the diagonal to the next. I find this so much faster and easier than having to actually draw a diagonal line and then sewing on the diagonal line. After I sew my binding strips together, I fold them in half lengthwise. I give them a good pressing with my iron, and then I attach them with a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the perimeter of my quilt. Now, getting to the corner, some people like to cut their threads, but I just pull that out, pull the thread kind of out a little ways, and then I push it back. I secure it with some back tacking, and then I just continue on to the next corner. I love to finish my quilts with hand binding. There is something very soothing about binding by hand, and I found that over the years my eyesight has changed, and I've found additional lighting and magnification to be a great help and benefit to me when binding quilts. Now, I'm using the Magnificent Pro by the Daylight Company to help with the binding. It illuminates the area and magnifies my viewpoint. I just love how this quilt came together. From piecing the fabric to quilting the top and then finally finishing with hand binding, I couldn't be happier. And I hope you found this video helpful. And if you'd like to make the Falling For You quilt, the pattern is available for download in my online shop. I also have fabric kits available for the solid fabric that I used, and I have some really lovely fall fat quarter bundles in my shop as well, which I think would make a lovely Falling For You quilt.